So, welcome everybody to one of our continuing, well, we call it a luncheon series, but unfortunately the food will it'll be a rain check for everybody. Lobster for everybody next year. But this is a continuing series through the Center for Human Rights and International Justice. And it's my happy task to welcome people to this, this presentation today on behalf of myself, on behalf of my co-director, Professor Brinton Likes, and our assistant director, Tim Karsh, and our assistant, Bonnie Waldron. So I should say at the outset, just because Massachusetts law requires it, that this is being recorded. So just so you know, attendees will not appear on the screen. You'll only be identified if you submit a question, which I very much encourage you to do. But the way to do that would be through the Q&A feature in Zoom. And you can actually submit questions anonymously. For my students, I would suggest that you not do that because I'd like to know who's doing what, but others are welcome to do it that way. Attendees do not need to mute themselves, so we don't have to worry about that. Professor Zamore, who I'm about to introduce, is going to speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll take questions. And you may submit your questions at any time during the presentation through the Q&A feature in Zoom. We aim to end at around 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. And I think that's all I want to say in light of the fact that we're starting a little late. Our topic for today is entitled The Arc of Protection, Reforming the International Refugee Regime. And we are very fortunate to have one of the leading experts in the world on this subject, Leah Zamore, who is a senior policy analyst who directs the Humanitarian Crises program at NYU's Center on International Cooperation. She also co-directs an experts group on global refugee policy and is the co-author with Alex Aleinikoff, who is now at the New School, of The Arc of Protection, Reforming the International Refugee Regime, which was published in November 2019 by Stanford University Press. I highly recommend that you buy that book and read it. Prior to her current position, Ms. Zamore taught international human rights law as a visiting professor in Sao Paulo, Brazil, served as a special advisor to the federal government in Brasilia on refugee and humanitarian issues, and worked as a policy advisor to the Deputy High Commissioner of the UN Refugee Agency in Geneva. She has worked in Ethiopia, Northern Uganda, South Africa, France, Kosovo, and India. And she is a lawyer in addition to everything else. And I'm about to turn it over to her, except that I now see that oh, there she is. Okay. Are you all set?
I am. I just I couldn't figure out how to turn the volume down on a phone, and yeah, so I just put it outside.
Okay, well, you have many, many high-level skills, and now you can work on the lower-level ones. Like
yeah, my tech skills are an abomination for sure.
All right, well, we're honored to have you. Please speak for 20, 25 minutes or so about your work, and my hope is that the attendees will then offer some questions.
Yes, that's very much my hope too. All right, well, no, thank you so much. Thank you, Dan and Tim and the center, which is the Center for Human Rights and International Justice, we know. I'm really delighted to be here. I wish we were all in Boston together. I was very much looking forward to that, but here we are. I think the first thing I want to say for anybody who may actually be interested in publishing a book, it is not ideal. You know, as Dan just mentioned, the book came out in November of 2019, so right before a global pandemic, which is not ideal from a kind of book publishing perspective at all.
Although I think the Canterbury Tales actually came out right before a pandemic.
That's a good point. Yeah, all right. No, maybe there is something to it. Well, and we have the kind of fortune and then for I think the rest of the world, not so fortunate that I think the arguments hold up, perhaps even more so, but for all kind of the wrong reasons. So I definitely want to get to the pandemic and its impact on refugees and sort of thread that through the book. But just to start off, so this is a book that Alex Aleinikoff and I, he was at the time, he was the Deputy High Commissioner of UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. And I was working with him. And this was in 2015 when there was what was considered a global refugee crisis, although it was centered predominantly on Europe and the Mediterranean. And there was a lot of policy discussions and all of these things. And we started to realize that in fact, the bigger crisis was the one behind the news or not in the news, which was the sort of forgotten crises where refugees were not actually trying to seek asylum. They had been admitted into a country, but then, their lives were still desperate and life-threatening. And so we started to focus on, how is it that we have a whole international regime for refugees, which, there's a lot of vulnerable groups in the world, and they don't necessarily have a dedicated UN agency and their own convention. So we have this whole refugee regime. So how was it that the plight of refugees in countries that had admitted them, that had given them asylum, was still so desperate? And so that was sort of the focus, was kind of looking beyond the headlines at what we thought was actually the bigger crisis in many ways. And so we started toying with this idea of the second exile, that, the first exile, of course, is when refugees have to flee, whether it's because of persecution or violence or conflict linked with natural disasters, and sort of climate displacement, of course, is becoming a bigger and bigger reality. But most of the world's refugees then and now, and for decades, have actually been in only a handful of developing countries in the global south that neighbor refugees' own countries. So they're not predominantly in Europe, they're not predominantly in the United States or in Australia or in any of the countries that really, where the refugee issue is so salient politically, but the numbers are actually tiny compared to the numbers in, for instance, your Lebanons or your Ugandas. And so what we wanted to do was kind of focus attention on those sort of forgotten crises where refugees had actually been admitted. So it wasn't predominantly, although the book does get into a lot of the politics of borders, but what happens to refugees actually once they've been admitted into a country and they're in theory in a safe place, and then what happens? And so what we wanted to do, was focus the world's attention, or the reader's attention at least, on those issues. And the challenges there are severalfold. So again, refugees have been admitted, but then what? Now, those who, for instance, have taken this immigration course or other courses will know that the Refugee Convention is actually geared specifically to this problem. It says very little about borders and entry. In fact, one of the main flaws in the convention is that there is no right of entry. There's no right to enjoy. There's, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has a right to seek and enjoy asylum. But there's no actual right to seek and enjoy asylum in any specific country. And so it's sort of a right without grounding. But the convention is very much geared towards refugees who are already in the host state, and then what happens to them. And it has a whole panoply of rights that they're supposed to have: right to education, right to work, right to social security, right to start their own businesses, right to have children and access courts, all of these things. But that's actually not what the refugee regime predominantly does for refugees that have already been admitted in a country. So for instance, you have a whole humanitarian aid architecture that's predominantly focused on refugees who are in camps. Now, the convention says refugees has a right to freedom of movement. Camps, of course, are not places of freedom of movement. They're not places of work. They're not places of social security. Education is very sparse, although it does exist. And so this disconnect between sort of what the convention says and then what the reality is for most refugees who have been admitted to safety, but then what? That was sort of the question that we wanted to look at. And so the book sort of goes through a whole kind of history of what's changed since the convention was enacted. One of the main problems, for instance, was that it is incredibly a Eurocentric document. It's very much of its time. It's the 1951 Refugee Convention. And it was a 1951 post-war Europe document. And so, for instance, the very definition of refugee was defined as someone displaced in Europe prior to 1951. So anybody displaced outside of Europe or displaced, for instance, by sort of colonialism and decolonization processes or Cold War proxy wars in the global South was not actually a refugee under the definition. There was a later protocol, but it was a voluntary thing that states could adopt or not. So the convention had its own flaws, although it also got a lot right. And what we try to focus on was both of those things. And what I think it definitely got right, which is missing, and we're seeing this with COVID, which I want to get to in a minute, so vividly, was that it set up all of these rights for refugees once they were admitted. So it left out the challenge of, well, what if nobody lets them in, which is what we're seeing basically everywhere now. But then what happens if the only places that they can be admitted and are admitted don't have a welfare state for their own citizens? So I mean, it's a very kind of welfare state, again, it's of its era, sort of European welfare state style idea of rights. So what happens if you're a refugee in Uganda, which is already struggling to provide services and protections for its own citizens, and then to ask them, just the politics of that ask are such a heavy lift. And so that's how we get this kind of perpetual humanitarian aid in camps problem, which we sort of call the second exile, which is that you have a regime of rights of a time built for a kind of government or a kind of state that doesn't exist for kind of very political economy reasons in the countries where refugees are predominantly located, which again is in a handful of countries in the global South. So that, in sort of a very rough nutshell, is what the book tries to unpack. And then we sort of get into the solutions and the kind of policy discussions. We sort of not so flatteringly call it the new liberal consensus, which I'm happy to go into if there are questions about it. I know we're sort of a little bit pressed for time, so I do actually just want to say a few things about what's happened since COVID, which is, I think the book sort of argues that the refugee regime was already starting to fall apart a bit. You had the main sort of destination countries shutting their borders. You have a whole regime of containment and deterrence, where especially the richer countries just make it almost impossible for refugees to actually reach their shores, on the theory that they actually have no legal obligations to them unless they're physically in the country, which is a kind of specious argument, but one that they've adopted. And so, you've already had that kind of trend line. And COVID has just sort of hit the gas pedal on things that a lot of states already wanted to do. So basically the entire world has shut its borders. And now what you're seeing is refugees are being stranded in deserts. They're being forcibly returned to places like Libya, where then, they get off at the port and then the port is bombed. They're being detained. We know that, of course, in this country, and this is, it's pre-COVID as well, but it's just become more desperate and more dire. And so you have a kind of acceleration of negative trends that were already going. And the other important thing, I think, is that there's almost no popular outcry because COVID is so all-consuming. That, before, for instance, when the Trump administration or a different administration would, family separation or these kinds of policies, there was mass public outcry. People were outraged. And that is much more muted now, which means that governments are starting to get away with things that they may have wanted to do this whole time. But now, because everybody is so understandably not distracted, but consumed by COVID, there's not a kind of mass popular resistance. And so the worry is, of course, that these things will outlast COVID. And then, you've got the problem of scapegoating of refugees that, pandemics throughout history have traditionally been blamed on foreigners and outsiders. And that's certainly true today, even though we know that COVID was actually seeded by business and leisure travelers. So that's another huge problem. And that's a problem, from Greece, where the main refugee camp was just burnt to the ground, to Yemen, where Ethiopian refugees are being blamed for COVID, to Afghanistan, where conditions got so bad for refugees in Iran that they actually went back to Afghanistan. And because Iran was in the middle of a COVID outbreak, that sort of did get seeded a bit by the returnees. And so now you've got all these kind of tensions and social animosities around refugees and returnees and COVID. But to my mind, the biggest, well, they're all big, but the biggest story is actually economic. So mercifully, there's not yet a major outbreak in a refugee camp of COVID. And again, I say not yet. The conditions are right because there's no sort of, the healthcare access is so limited, and people, the population density is so high, and there's a lot of comorbidities with kind of health problems. But for most refugees, actually, the life-threatening part of COVID is the economic crisis that's hitting. Again, most of them live in developing countries, and those economies are just being hammered, and so incomes are dropping. Humanitarian aid is being reduced because prices have gone up. So aid levels actually have remained steady so far, although they may go down next year. But shipping costs are up 300%. So the same amount of aid can reach, a much fewer amount of refugees. So for instance, the UN has had to cut food rations in East Africa for refugees by 30% in the middle of the pandemic. So those are the kinds of things. We're seeing a hunger crisis. Some countries are actually on the verge of famine, and they have both refugees and internally displaced people in them. And so that, I think, is the main worry. And again, the challenge is that, of course, COVID has introduced new problems, but it's really mainly exacerbated the existing ones. And the problem here was that refugees were either left on their own with very little support, or the support that they got was humanitarian aid in a kind of camp setting, which was never going to be enough to allow them to rebuild their lives, let alone to kind of battle a pandemic in the way that I think would be in any sense in accordance with the rights that they have as humans, or the rights that are in the Refugee Convention. So I may pause there and just see if there are questions, or else I could continue.
Why don't you continue if you have more that you wanted to say? I think you could probably go for another 10 minutes or so. I have a couple of questions myself, and then there is one that's already been posted, but I'd love to hear a little more if you have more. Otherwise, it's really totally up to you.
No, I mean, I could definitely, the challenge has been to kind of condense more than to expand. So one thing that I want to get to is a bit about the thinking on sort of what to do. And a lot of this thinking comes from before COVID, but has continued into it. So one of the biggest shifts in the kind of refugee policy space recently has been the growing involvement of development actors. So for reasons of history and ideology and sort of dysfunction, there's a pretty stark divide within the multilateral system between the humanitarian agencies on one side and the development agencies on the other. And then, of course, you have sort of peace and peace-building actors. And it's a very siloed system. There are different agencies, they have different funding mechanisms, different timelines, they speak different languages. They do different things, although that's becoming quite blurry. But of course, as I mentioned, most refugees are in a kind of protracted, the second exile, and that goes on generations. So to give one example, Dadaab, which until recently was the world's biggest refugee camp, which is in Kenya, it was opened in 1991 for people fleeing Somalia at the time. And it now has at least, because this is a few years old, 10,000 children who have been born to mothers who were themselves born in Dadaab, which makes 3 generations, 2 of which have never actually known life outside of that camp. And so you start to see kind of how generational is displacement and is refugee exile. And so it's not a humanitarian emergency in that sense, because, an emergency, at least that the way we usually think of that word, is some kind of short-term aberration from whatever the underlying normal is. But if the emergency is generational, then it's a very different thing, which requires, again, it can't just be very short-term humanitarian aid with agencies on a kind of 1-year timeline. And so the thinking has been recently that we need development support. A, they've got much bigger budgets and much longer time horizons, but B, in theory, they have the expertise and the mandates to actually address these much longer term type of issues: access to education, access to healthcare, work and livelihoods, those kinds of issues that are not just about getting emergency aid into a situation, but really about longer term structural changes to to make a place or a context or a population habitable and sort of, human rights compliant. So this has been, I think, an important shift recently. And there's much good to be said about it. So UNHCR and the World Bank, for instance, have a much closer partnership than they used to. The UN Development Program is increasingly involved in displacement contexts. And this is all, it's been a long conversation, a very long conversation, but it is accelerating recently. And so I think that's definitely something important to know and to unpack. The one thing I'll say about it, though, which we get at in the book, and that I've written about in other places, is that it really matters what the development model is. So as I said, the main sort of worry or concern that I have about COVID for refugees is the economic one, the political economic one. And there you're seeing that the development model or the economic model in the countries where most refugees live is not, is in many ways catastrophic for poor people, and refugees are the poorest of the poor. And so it is therefore catastrophic for them. So for instance, debt levels are just skyrocketing, and they were already very, very high in these countries. So a lot of them spend much, much more on debt servicing to their external partners than they do on healthcare for their own citizens. So again, let alone refugees. So this is a huge problem. Another one is, that the economic model was specialized in a single export commodity, export that to the world market, use the income you gain from that to buy food and import all the other things you need. Well, now commodities, there's a commodity shock. Oil is at records low, metal, all of these other things. So an economy tied to a single commodity export, now the governments have no money. So Nigeria, for instance, is doing an extreme austerity budget right now where it's actually slashing health costs in the middle of a global pandemic. So this I think is the worry, that it's very, very important that there be economic and development support for hosting countries that then redounds to the benefit of refugees. But it really does matter what the underlying economic model is that people have in mind. And again, it gets to this idea that the convention had a specific development model in mind, which was the European welfare state. And for a lot of decades after that, including in the global south, in the places where refugees are now, that was also the model. They called it the developmental state, but it's very similar. I mean, Tanzania was a major refugee hosting country, and they wanted free education, free healthcare, free social security, all of it for citizens and refugees. And then things began to change in the 1980s for a variety of reasons. And that is exactly the same time as well that there was a kind of backlash against refugees because the economic model changed. All of a sudden, citizens weren't getting state services. They were certainly not going to then be happy with refugees getting those services. And so the convention, the rights in the convention more or less went out the window. So refugees were still admitted, they were still given safety, but they weren't given the rest of the rights that they were entitled to. So now I'm not sure how we are on time.
Okay, now we have 3 excellent questions from participants, and I'm sure there'll be more rolling in. So let me just thank you. This is a very provocative and very painful subject to talk about, and I think you elucidated really well. I wanted to ask you 2 sort of big framing questions, and we've talked about these things before, and obviously, I mean, I could talk to you about this forever, but I had two sort of beginning questions, and then I'll read some of the other questions, but maybe this would be a way to just elaborate a little bit on some of the things that you just said. One thought is the question of whether COVID and the experience with COVID has really fundamentally changed the world perception, not only of refugees, but on basic ideas of movement across borders and sovereign power. And I'm kind of thinking of it as a negative analogy to what happened in the post-World War II period. You know, as Hannah Arendt explained, there was a period before the Holocaust and before the rise of National Socialism in which there was already this minorities regime in Europe. There was already a problem. So in many ways, the regime that developed in 1951 was not only a result of the Second World War, but had been brewing since the late 19th century and certainly through the early 20th. And I'm getting the feeling that we could view COVID in a similar way, but actually in a negative way, as a reactionary example of that. where, as you say, the refugee regime was already crumbling, Europe was struggling with all these issues, and now we have this, which is a complete reaffirmation of borders, individual nation states, and sovereign power. So that's one question. Let me just ask them both because they're related, and maybe you can just sort of riff on both of them a little bit. The other thing is about development, which again, you and I have spoken about before, and I'm more skeptical than you about development money, because I always want to ask the question, where is this money really coming from? And what is the real agenda? You know, I was watching Sheldon Whitehouse yesterday on dark money around the Supreme Court, and I'm thinking about, you know, the money in development comes with various agendas. For example, if China is funding these agencies, obviously they want to see certain things. So I worry about that in terms of it may be helpful for refugees, but it can be harmful in other ways of experimental models for nation states or supporting their own people. So I know we're in a crisis. I mean, we're in a desperate situation and we need more money. But I guess I just want to confess that I have this worry about the development agenda as compared to the law agenda, the idea of saying these are rights and we have to just build on that. However much that didn't work and it was situated in a European vision, is this development thing will supplant the idea of human rights. And it just feels kind of utilitarian and dark money-ish to me sometimes. So that's a confession. If you want to talk about those a little bit, then I got 3 questions from 3 attendees, and I'm sure there'll be more rolling in.
Okay, no, thank you. No, those are 2 really, really great questions. So on the first one, I mean, COVID is having as I said, I think it's just accelerating a trend that was already there. I mean, refugee scholars started talking about the non-entry regime in Europe, or sort of fortress Europe, beginning in the 80s. And the same thing would apply to the US. So, you know, where all of a sudden, again, because of the politics of displacement changed, you know, after World War II, refugees were predominantly white and they were predominantly fleeing communist regimes. In fact, because they were literally defined. I mean, until 1980, the United States defined a refugee as someone fleeing a communist country. And so they had political value because they were symbols of Soviet aggression. And so, you know, there was a whole regime, but sort of the idea of admission or even, you know, resettlement was very high for a very long time. And so you did have a kind of allowance for a level of mobility that then began to disappear in the 80s. So I don't want to I don't want to overemphasize the role of COVID, but it has absolutely accelerated the trend. So we started to see in the 2015 crisis, you know, within Europe, the Schengen program allows, you know, free movement. There basically aren't really borders. And you started to see fences going up. And so that was quite jarring. Now it's that, except without the outcry, without the politics around it, and it's global. Everybody is shutting their borders. So my worry is that they're justifying it right now because of COVID. COVID, you know, we don't know how long COVID is going to go, but whenever it ends, the worry will be that's now the status quo. And there'll be a kind of status quo bias to get it undone. And that, I think, is a really important task that we have to, especially as human rights lawyers, start to actually plan and fight against and mobilize support about now, because whenever the pandemic is done, it's going to be hard because governments, a lot of them wanted to do it anyway. But the other thing to know about COVID is that it's been a very immobilizing thing. I think a lot of us know that. I'm not in Boston. Americans can't really travel anywhere. Travel has become so, we're all sort of a bit immobilized. But there's 2 things to know about that. One is the idea that sort of refugee-dom is about mobility, I think is actually not quite true, because that's the second exile. I mean, refugees are locked in and locked out. So most of them actually do get admitted and there's that mobility. But once they're admitted to the neighboring country, they can't move. They're either in camps, they're in detention. So there's been an immobilization within the sort of refugee sphere for a long time. That now has, again, also been accelerated, you know, detention and these kinds of things. But the lockdowns have also been a huge upheaval. I mean, you know, I don't know if others saw, but, you know, months ago in India, when India announced its lockdown, millions of people fled the cities to the countryside. And we saw the same thing, as I mentioned, with Afghans in Iran. All of a sudden in Iran, life became untenable because there was no jobs and they were told they couldn't access healthcare. So you had hundreds of thousands of people fleeing. Now conditions have become so bad in Colombia and some of the other countries where Venezuelan refugees are, that they've been returning to Venezuela. So you have this kind of dual thing happening, both sort of in a negative direction for refugees, where there's more mobility and less mobility at the same time. And the worry is that both those trends in the wrong way would continue. So I think those who are interested in these ideas, there's a real need for thinking and, unpacking the politics of how do we actually address this once the pandemic is over. And then just quickly on the second question, I share your concern. I will say, so this idea of sort of development isn't new either. I mean, a big part of why the convention, this is my theory and sort of, yeah, it's something I've been meaning to write more about, but I think that the reason why, or one of the reasons why the Refugee Convention is actually so limited is because it was only one part of a much bigger scheme, which included the Marshall Plan, which again was only focused on Europe. But there was an enormous amount of money going into Europe from the United States, and most of that money was going to refugee hosting states in Central Europe. And I don't think that was an accident. And the development model behind the Marshall Plan was very different than the development model behind aid programs that came later. And it wasn't perfect, but it was supporting this kind of welfare state idea. And so I don't, so there's nothing intrinsically, I think, perhaps, except of course the power dynamics within aid are always going to be uncomfortable, to say the least. But the ideology of development and the sort of the role of economic thinking has shifted dramatically since then. And that, I think, is the part that folks worried about refugee rights really have to unpack, is what is this development model? What are these programs actually supporting? Because it's not always that there's not enough money, although there's not enough money. But the money that is there, what is it doing? And so I think you touched on what are the agendas of the donors. There can be a quid pro quo, and in a lot of ways, you could actually frame the addition, to the extent there is additional development money going to hosting states, as a kind of very uncomfortable quid pro quo, which is that the richer donor countries don't want refugees physically in their own countries. And so they're essentially buying their way out of their responsibilities through development money, which will then make the host countries happy because they get to use that money also for their own citizens. And so then they'll keep the refugees there. It's, in some framing, and we get at this in the book with this thing we call the new liberal consensus, in some ways that's actually maybe a least bad alternative, because what is the alternative? The rich countries aren't going to let them in any big numbers anyway. And if without the development money, the hosting countries might actually send people back to conflict and violence, and that would not obviously be ideal. So that, it's, in some levels, it's a framing issue about the influx of development aid. But you do have to wonder, is it a kind of buying yourself out of your moral and legal responsibilities? And then it still beggars the question of what's the money actually doing, and to whose benefit is it redounding? So.
Yeah, well, thank you. There's a lot more to say about all these things, but let me get to the questions that people posted. I'll just do them one at a time because they're actually quite distinct. So the first one is from Natalie Mays, who thanks you for this important discussion and then asks, when refugees encounter problems in their new countries, whom do you think should or could bear most of the responsibility? Should we rely on NGOs and humanitarian agencies for employment services, healthcare, et cetera, or should we focus on government policies, which can be, as you noted, particularly difficult in countries that can't provide these resources for their own citizens to begin with? We see this all over the world, obviously. I was struck by it, particularly in South Africa, where there was such a robust debate about that very issue. But if you'd like to respond to that, I'll hold off on the other two.
Thank you, Natalie. That's a great question, and it strikes at the core of some of these tensions. So, I mean, the easiest answer is both, and everybody bears some responsibility. But I think kind of the hard part about understanding what's going on is that there is almost a little bit of a symbiosis. So I'm thinking, for instance, about Chad. I was in Chad a few years ago, and in the places where refugees are in Chad, there's very, very little, if any, government presence. You know, they're not in the cities, they're kind of in the borderlands. And so it's the NGOs and the agencies that are actually providing people with life-saving aid. And they've got their own internal problems. And I really don't want to minimize, you know, there's lack of coordination and there's funding issues and, you know, competition, et cetera. But they are there, and they're, you know, the government isn't there, you know, and so in that sense is, you know, perhaps, you know, first of all, governments under international law and everything else are primarily responsible for humanitarian response and development and economic rights and all of the rest of it. So that would be one way of thinking about it. But the other way of thinking about it is, well, why isn't the government there? Yeah, no, in some cases, in some countries, it's because, you know, that area of the country has people that aren't politically powerful or that are politically opposed to the government. And so they're not doing state services there, or there's a conflict. There's a lot of reasons why a government might not be present in a refugee hosting area. But another one is simply capacity. You know, the government of Chad, especially with an oil shock, just, you know, they don't have money to fund even the basic things in the cities. So they can't be there. And so the question is, well, why, you know, again, why don't they have enough resources to have a presence, including in the regions where refugees are? But another issue is, I think that there starts to be a kind of, again, a symbiosis, or what some people call a kind of humanitarian alibi, that if a government thinks, well, the NGOs are there, you know, so we can use our resources somewhere else because they're there and they're doing the thing. And of course, refugees aren't our citizens, are kind of a global responsibility. So NGOs funded by the international community, that's their thing, and they should do that. And there's a lot of logic to that. Again, governments, especially poorer governments that are hosting refugees, are doing a global public good. You know, they're doing what the richer countries aren't even doing. And then they're being asked to bear the financial costs when they don't have enough money. So there's a lot to that. But again, the Chad example becomes an interesting one, because what's happened in the last few years is they've tried to address this specific tension. And what they've done is they've said, there aren't state services in the areas where refugees are, but there are refugee services that then Chadians can't access. And that was creating all kinds of sort of problems. And so what they've done is they've allowed Chadians to access the refugee services, so the, you know, schools and health clinics and stuff in these communities where the state didn't have a presence. But at the same time, the government has said, well, no, but we're not just NGOizing, you know, the services. And so what they've done is kind of nationalized the NGO services for refugees and now for Chadians. And so, for instance, refugee schools are now part of the Ministry of Education. They now teach the Chadian curriculum. There was a big hoopla when I was there because some refugee students took the baccalaureate or the high school exam and actually performed as well, if not better, than the Chadian students, which sort of showed the government that, wow, refugees can actually be super helpful to development in this country. And, you know, so we should invest in this. And so they essentially nationalized refugee response. So it now serves both people, both groups, and there is a sense of a win-win because the government's stepping in with responsibility, but the NGOs are there. I mean, they're still doing most of the service provision, and so it's a kind of co-responsibility thing, which I think is a better model than the one we have now, which is either the government does it or is to blame for not doing it, or the NGOs are not doing it. So, very good question.
Yeah, thank you. We have two more. One is from an anonymous attendee. I assume that's not the person's name. It just says anonymous attendee, but I guess you could change your name to anonymous attendee. And this person actually asked a question that I had wanted to pose too, which I'll amend it a little bit. The question as posed is, do you think of refugee issues are better handled through an international regime or through regional organizations such as the EU or the AU, the African Union? I wanted to hear what you think about this new pact, so-called, in Europe, because I know you must have thoughts about it, and maybe that could be part of your answer, because I find it kind of worrisome.
Me too. No, and it can be part of my answer. So again, this is a very good question. And again, it's a little bit of both. But, you know, I thinking back to kind of my constitutional law course, there was this idea that Justice Brennan had about a one-way ratchet when it came to rights. And he was, of course, thinking about the federal government versus the states, but it's a similar idea of the international versus the regional. And what his idea was, well, maybe the international sets a floor, but if the regional or the state level or whatever the other level, that in a rights expanding and protection oriented way, then they should absolutely be allowed to do that. And so I have a kind of a similar thought process, which is that it's very important that we do have an international regime of rights. But if regional organizations can go beyond what the international is doing in a rights protecting and pro-refugee way, then that I think is exactly what they should do. And we're seeing that. So IGAD in East Africa is coming out with, including since COVID, but even before that, coming out with a lot of incredibly good rights supporting policies on refugees about integrating them into schools in the region, integrate, freedom of movement, ending encampment, very, very progressive things that is actually in some ways going beyond what the international regime is doing at the moment. And that is not, I don't think, should ever be seen as like undermining the international regime. That should just totally be supported by the regime. But, and this is the idea of the one-way ratchet, if you have regional organizations that are actually undercutting the floor of rights that is set at the international level, then that's incredibly problematic. And that, I think, is the worry with Europe. That you do, it still is Fortress Europe. It's still a non-entry regime. There's no responsibility sharing within Europe. So they're still leaving it up to the border, the sort of the southern states to receive, and then they're supposed to keep them, and then they have no incentive. So it's still a mess. I think with the new agreement, they have something like mandatory solidarity, or just this idea of how do you proportion the roles and responsibilities within Europe, which is very, very worrisome, because the countries that are a bit farther afield have every incentive to minimize their responsibility, and the countries that are the receiving countries then have every incentive to minimize the ability of refugees to get to them or to have any kind of life that they would want to live as a disincentive for others. And so, no, I'm very worried about regional developments in that sense. So I think it really just matters on what is the regional organization doing, and is it rights expanding or rights contracting?
Yeah, I mean, one may begin to think of the US coordination with Mexico to deport Central Americans as a form of regional cooperation, exactly the opposite of a rights protective regime.
Yeah.
I've been researching and writing on some of those kinds of experiments, Italy and Libya and Spain and Morocco, so there's this whole other regime of the anti-rights international and regional cooperation regimes.
Well, and again, there, and just on that point, there it gets to the issue, the worry around development aid is that a lot of what's greasing those wheels really is the promise of development aid, on the theory that, well, if we help the economies grow there, people won't come, which is this kind of empirically specious, because up until a certain income level, actually growth and development mean more people migrating rather than fewer. But it is this sort of, it's essentially, is it supporting a containment regime that is totally against the human rights of refugees, because
Right.
essentially the incentives for the governments in Niger and Libya and the other ones to actually take those deportees or stop them from reaching Europe to begin with.
Yeah, it also tends to connect with various other national and international security regimes and anti-drug trafficking things, and it tends to co-opt anti-human trafficking initiatives. I mean, there's just a lot to say about that.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Anyway, we'll run out of time if I don't get to the last question, which is a good one. So I want to make sure you have time to reflect on this. This is from Shanteri Leah. She says, I'm reflecting on your statement of generational refugees, which is back to the beginning of your presentation. And she asks, is there a theoretical way to break the cycle of something generational like this? And I guess that means also maybe a practical way. Is there a way to keep politics out of this entirely, or is that just a pipe dream? I'm thinking specifically of migrants in the northeastern Indian state of Assam, which has several generations of migrants and refugees that have lived in dire poverty. And which, by the way, this is my addition to this, has also, as I'm sure you know, witnessed a real xenophobic upsurge in terms of citizenship policies and deportations.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's another great question. So on some level, actually, why do we want, so in one world, and again, I'm thinking of the world of the Refugee Convention, why do we want to break this cycle? I mean, it used to be that what the literature used to call the exilic bias, the bias towards exile, that exile was actually a good thing. And it was considered a permanent thing, that there was no assumption of return or or anything, that in fact, once refugees had acquired a new human community to live in and they wanted to stay there, that they should stay there their whole life and their kids should be born there and raised there. And this idea that then, you know, a generation down, they would have to return or anything was sort of so foreign. Again, this was, I don't think you can take the politics out of anything, but you can replace bad politics with good politics. And so I think it's important to note, the problem, I don't think, is the protractedness itself. The fact, for instance, that most refugees stay refugees on average for like 26 years, I think is the statistic right now. That's problematic only because the conditions that they're living in for those 26 years are abhorrent. But if they weren't, if they were the conditions that envisioned in the Refugee Convention, envisioned in the human rights instruments, envisioned in sort of the sort of regular migration schemes of most countries, then that actually is a solution. That is the solution. Make it generational. Allow them to stay forever. And if they choose for whatever reason to go back to their country, to go to another country, that is great too. But it's not actually a bad thing that they and their descendants would actually stay in the country of refuge. What makes it bad is the conditions that they're forced to live in, and the precarity and the uncertainties around their, even just their status in that country. And that's where the protractedness becomes a problem. And that's where the generational becomes a problem. So if they're confined, again, the Dadaab example, if they're confined to one camp for generations, then that is the cycle we have to break. So not necessarily the time that they're displaced or in exile or, you know, abroad or becoming a citizen of a new country or whatever the process may be, but what are the conditions and what are their choices, their life choices for them and for their children and their friends and their loved ones. So that's the worry, that, you know, it is the dire poverty, and this applies equally to internal migrants as it does to refugees or to internally displaced people or whatever the category is. The condition is, if it's generational poverty and marginalization and scapegoating and xenophobia, that's the cycle that we have to break.
Okay, well, I'm looking at the time and I don't see any other questions, and we're just about right on time. So I fear that if I ask another question, we're going to be talking for the next 40 minutes about it. So let's docket that ahead. I would just want to thank you heartily. I can really not think of a more important subject, and I can't imagine a better way of presenting it. I really appreciate your precision and your understanding of this in a global sense. And I've certainly learned a lot from your book and from listening to you talk about these things. And I'm sure my students did as well. We do owe you lunch. So you can come and get that anytime, or when things get a little better, we can send you something.
Yeah. I've been wanting to get to Boston, so no, I'd be really delighted for that lunch.
Well, we'll find a way to do that, and maybe we'll just invite you for something to join us in some event without having to put more work into it on your part. But I really appreciate you doing this for us. It was very, very excellent. And let's keep in touch. And if other people have questions that they present to me afterwards, you know, maybe I'll forward them to you. But
yes, please do. No, and feel free to give my email to any students who are interested.
Okay, and do keep in touch with the center and let us know. I know last time you were saying you were looking for some research assistance on this or that, so keep me in the loop. If there's anything we can do to help your work, I'd be more than happy to do it.
I will. No, I'm always looking for folks who are interested in these subjects, so I will certainly be in touch on that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And everybody's applauding virtually in wherever they are.
It's sweet if they are.
Yeah. All right, thanks. Take care. Bye.
Bye, everybody.